Pastor Brian Wolfmuller here, surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses at the Spiritual Life Center in Wichita, and was looking at these church fathers and remembered that we have in our Lutheran confessions a great document. One of the things that the Lutherans were doing was teaching on the Lord's Supper. And to do that, they had to also speak of Christ. And so especially Article 8 of the Formula of Concord, mostly written by Martin Chemnitz in 1577, has a lot to do with the two natures of Christ. And one of the things that the Lutheran Fathers do is to support that is they come along and they provide at the end of the Book of Concord, published in 1580, what was called a Catalogue of Testimonies, where they gathered quotes from the Church Fathers and used them to teach the two natures of Christ. So now I was sitting there looking at all the Church Fathers that we have and found quotes from the Catalogue of Testimonies of these guys, and I thought I'd read them to you. Now I'll try to put the full quotes down there below, and the link to the Catalogue of Testimonies for your own reading as well. So the first is from Athanasius. So he is 295 to 373, and here's just a quote on the Arian and Catholic Confessions. Athanasius says, "God was not changed into human flesh or substance, but in himself glorified the nature which he assumed, so that the human, weak and mortal flesh and nature advanced to and obtained divine glory, so as to have all power in heaven and on earth, which it did not have before it was assumed by the Word." That's the genus majestaticum, that the divine attributes were communicated to the human nature of Christ. Next, we have Hilary of Poitiers, 315 to 367. So here's just one of the quotes from the Catalogue of Testimonies on Hilary. "That thus the man Jesus remained in the glory of God the Father, if the flesh had been united to the glory of the Word, and the assumed flesh possessed the glory of the Word." Next, Ephraim the Syrian didn't make it into the Catalogue of Testimonies. I don't know why not. Anyway, he's there. So next we have Basil the Great, the tasty church father. And he says, they have got a bunch of Basil quoted there, but here's just one of them. On the Holy Nativity of Christ, "In what manner is the Deity in the flesh? Just as fire in iron, not by transition, but by impartation. For fire does not run out to the iron, but remaining in its place, imparts to its own peculiar power, which is not diminished by the impartation, and fills the entire mass that becomes partaker of it." In fact, there's kind of two official metaphors for how the divine nature and the human nature are joined to each other in the Book of Concord. One is fire and iron, and the other is the soul and the body, to explain how the divine nature and the human nature in Christ are able to be united to one another without destroying one another. And that first illustration comes from Basil. Next, we have Gregory Nazianzen. Interesting that our Book of Concord has a bunch of quotes from Gregory of Nyssa, but none from Gregory of Nazianzen. Someone who's smarter in these things can tell you why. We get to Cyril of Jerusalem. The Cyril that we have is also not the Cyril of Jerusalem. We have Cyril of Alexandria, so we got to keep moving. Here's St. Jerome. He forgot to wear all of his clothes. He had a cell in Jerusalem where he did the translation of the Bible. And I thought I had some Jerome in here, but I didn't. So we're at St. John Chrysostom, who we have, for example, here's John Chrysostom, 349 to 407 are his dates down there. And just one quote, for example, on Hebrews 2. He says, "For it is the really great and wonderful and full of awe that our flesh, should be seated above, and be worshipped by angels and archangels, and by the seraphim and cherubim. Reflecting upon this, I am often entranced and seem to be beside myself." And then he says the same on 1 Corinthians chapter 10. "This body, even when lying in the manger, the Magi worshipped, and they took a long journey, and having come, they worshipped with much fear and trembling." And then in his epistle 65 that he wrote to Leo, who's on the wall over there, we'll get to Leo in just a minute, he says, "Let us learn to know which nature it is to which the Father said, 'Share my seat.' It is the nature to which it has been said, 'Dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return.' So here he reflects on how Jesus' human nature is combined and given then worship divine attributes. Ambrose was the favorite of these Lutherans. 339 to 397, he's here. And so here's just a couple of lines from Ambrose. You have learned that he can subject all things to himself undoubtedly, according to the operation of deity. Learn now that he receives, according to his flesh, all things as subjected to him, as it is written, Ephesians 1, according to the flesh, therefore, all things are delivered to him and are subject. Or later, again, another Ambrose quote, God does not give to the apostles participation in his seat, but to Christ, according to his humanity, is given participation in the divine seat. Or, in Christ our common human nature, according to the flesh, has obtained the prerogative of the heavenly seat. So at the ascension and the exaltation of Jesus, he entered into the full use of his divine nature. All right, we got two more. St. Augustine, who's here? He came after Ambrose. His dates are 354 to 430. That's what St. Augustine looked like. That's what his picture is. Of course, Augustine was another favorite of the Lutherans. Lutheran was an Augustinian monk before he gave that guy up. But they love to read and study Augustine. So here's one quote that we show. On the works of the Lord, Augustine says, if Christ is not God by nature, but a creature, he's neither to be worshipped nor adored as God. But to these things they will reply and say, why then is it that you adore with his divinity his flesh, which you do not deny to be a creature, and are no less devoted to it than to the deity? In other words, as we worship the flesh of Jesus, we testify the fact that the personal union is a thorough union, in fact, that all the attributes of the divinity are taken up into his humanity. That's what they are pointing out. Cyril, here's our Cyril of Alexandria, 375 to 444. And here's a Cyril quote. On the incarnation, the Word introduced himself into that which he was not, in order that the nature of man also might become what it was not, resplendent by its union with the grandeur of divine majesty, which has been raised beyond nature, rather than it has been cast the unchangeable God beneath its nature. So that God became what he was not, so that human nature would become what it is not. Just beautiful stuff. Cyril on the incarnation. Peter Chrysostom, he didn't show up. But Leo, our last one, Leo the Great, whose dates are 400 to 461. Leo gets quoted a few times, especially we have here Epistle 23, which says on Ephesians 1, let the adversaries of the truth declare when or according to what nature the Almighty Father raised his Son above all things, or to what substance or nature he subjected to all things. For to the deity, as to the Creator, all things have always been subject. If power was added to him, if sublimity was exalted, it was inferior to him who exalted, and did not have the riches of that nature of whose liberality it stood in need. But a person holding such views, Arius receives into his fellowship. So in that he denies that it was the divine nature of Jesus that received gifts, but rather his human nature. So that's Leo the Great. So there we are, the Catalogue of Testimonies. I'm going to post up these quotes in the description of this video so you can see them, as well as the link to the Catalogue of Testimonies. And I would encourage you to take a look and study it, and to realize, if nothing else, that these guys were pretty smart. And they had a lot of very helpful things to say as they meditated on the two natures of Christ and this second great mystery of our Christian faith.